Welcome back to the Shadows. Tonight, we're diving into true tales of terror that linger long after the lights are back on. Some of these stories are whispers passed down, others are confessions people were never supposed to share. But all of them carry one thing in common. Once you hear them, you'll never feel truly alone again, no matter where you are. I never believed in haunted houses. I didn't believe in curses or restless spirits or any of the things you hear on late-night forums. I believed in explanations. Pipes, mice, old insulation, the kind of noises a place makes after decades of weather and sloppy repairs. That's what I told myself the first night at the lake house. My partner found the place online. A 2-story cabin set back from the road. One of those listings with a bunch of photos taken on a cloudy day that made everything look antique and romantic. A fixer-upper, she said. Cheap, private, think of the weekends. We drove out on a Saturday with a truck full of tools, convinced we could make it ours in time for summer. The owner met us at the gate, an old man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same wood the house was built from. He handed us the keys and said one thing that stuck with me. It sits funny sometimes. You'll know when it tells you to leave. He laughed like it was a joke. We did not. The house sits about 50 feet from the lake. From the porch, you can see the water curve away into reeds and trees. In the daytime, it looked like any neglected cottage. Flaking paint, a crooked dock, windows with that familiar fog of decades-old glass. It felt private, which is what we wanted. No neighbors for a long stretch. The town was small, and we were city people looking for quiet. That first evening, after we hauled boxes and tools inside, we opened a bottle, set a playlist on low, and sat on the porch watching the sun lower into the water. The lake was still, like glass laid over a dark chest. We slept in the upstairs bedroom because it had the better view. The mattress was halfway between new and broken. The heater rattled, but it worked. I woke first, like I always do, around 3 in the morning. For a moment, I thought it was rain, a soft, steady sound on the roof, but when I turned to look, the window was black and clear. The sound continued, irregularly, like something tapping gently on the siding. It was a soft, hollow noise. I lay there, listening. My partner slept beside me, breathing shallow and steady. The house sighed and settled, and everything felt ordinary again, so I let it go. Over the next few days, the house collected small, unnerving details. The kitchen faucet dripped in a pattern that never matched a regular leak. Drip, pause, drip, drip. A gap of several long seconds, then the sequence repeated. We found a broom hung in the basement with the bristles facing the wall, like someone had set it there in a hurry. The old wood in the hallway flexed underfoot, making a long, bone-deep creak that sounded almost human when you pressed your ear to it. Once, I came downstairs and the light over the sink was on, though we swore we hadn't left it that way. My partner laughed, shrugged, and said the house had a personality. I laughed back, but the laugh felt thin. The lake itself changed the soundscape. At night, the water made noises you don't get in the city, soft slapping against the dock. The low murmur of frogs, a far-off animal calling. Sometimes the wind pushed the reeds into the house and the air smelled like old algae and sun-warmed wood. It was peaceful mostly. But then there were nights when you could hear something moving through the reeds that wasn't water or wind. Some slow, patient rustling that moved along the edge of the shore and then stopped, as if listening. One night, a week in, I woke to the smell of something like burned paper. The bedroom was dark, and the clock on the bedside table read 2:17. I lay still, trying to tell myself I had dreamed it when it happened again. A soft thump coming from downstairs like a book being set on a table. My heart knocked against my ribs in a small, quick rhythm. I crept out of bed and felt for my phone. The house seemed too loud when I moved. The pipes sang, the stairs inhaled. I padded downstairs and all the lights were off. The living room was shadow and silhouette. On the coffee table, where we had stacked a handful of old maps and one of the owner's books, the top map had been turned face down. It was a small change, but nothing else in the room had moved. I told my partner the next morning. She said maybe the house was settling, or that the old owner had come by to check something and left without saying. We called the number on the contract. It went to voicemail. We told each other to stop noticing. It's amazing how, once you start pointing out small oddities, they multiply. You notice every creak as a message. You measure silence like a thing that could bend. One afternoon, we decided to walk the shoreline. It was late. The sunlight had thinned out and was warm but tired. The dock had a missing board near the end. Someone had shoved a plank over it like a bandage. Underneath, the water smelled like iron. We walked beyond the dock where the cattails grew thick. The ground was soft and our boots sank a little. About 30 feet into the reeds, we found old footprints in the mud. Bare, narrow, as if someone had been walking in socks. No shoes. They led away from the water and then vanished into the bush, ending abruptly as if the person had stepped into something that devoured footprints. There was a loop of twine snagged over a branch a few feet away, frayed and wet. It looked like a snare someone had set for raccoons, but the twine was too clean, too deliberate. That night, the tapping noise returned, louder now, coming from the side of the house, facing the lake. It started as an hour-long rhythm at dusk, slow and steady. We sat on the living room floor with flashlights because the power had gone out, trying to find logical causes. A branch, a raccoon, a boat knocking against the dock. The sound would move, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, like fingers tracing the wood. When we shone a light out the window, there was only black and the faint reflection of ourselves in the glass. On the third night after we discovered the footprints, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was almost too faint to be more than a suggestion, a harmony made from the house creaking, the heater stuttering, and a little more. I listened, trying to align it with the cadence of real words. My partner slept. The whispering seemed to come from the hallway, the narrow strip of shadow between the stairs and the basement door. I put on a sweater, grabbed the heavy flashlight we kept by the door, and walked toward it. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house, and the beam of the flashlight carved the dark in a small, unreliable cone. The whispering stopped when I reached the basement door. I sat on the top step, my breath fogging under the beam. The door was shut. There was a single dry mark on the wood, like a fingernail had scraped across it. For no clear reason, I pressed my ear to the door. A faint, wet noise, not quite breathing, tapped against the other side. It wasn't a human breath. It had a wetness to it, like moss or someone pressed to a tent. I pulled back and the hair on my arms prickled. I shifted, and somewhere in the house a floorboard gave a long, slow creak like a resigned sigh. I went back upstairs and slept on the couch for the rest of the night. My partner asked me groggy why I hadn't come back to bed. I said I'd heard a noise. She said I should go back to sleep. She did not ask more. There are things partners do and don't ask about in small hours. We started leaving lights on. We kept the radio tuned to static and low music. We thought it would make the house feel inhabited, like a deterrent. One morning, the radio had been moved to the bedroom and turned up just enough that the static bled into song. There wasn't a station we listened to. The playlist on my phone had not been touched. The thought that someone had been in the house when we slept made my stomach hollow. The next evening, a storm rolled in from the lake. Rain at first, then wine thick enough to press tree branches against the siding. The power blinked and then stuttered out, leaving us with candles and a sense of being boxed in. We huddled in the kitchen, eating cold food out of a can, listening to the house collect sound. The tapping on the siding was relentless now, timed with the wind. When I went to check the windows, the lower pane in the kitchen had been fogged from the inside with a pattern like a handprint that had been dragged sideways. Not a full print, just streaks, as if someone had tried to see out and given up. Around midnight, the tapping stopped. The silence was heavy, like snow falling on top of everything. I felt it in my chest. Then a single slow scrape came from the landing between the first and second floors. Not a creak, but a deliberate movement along the banister. It was the sound of something being dragged. We froze. The candlelight made our shadows long and stupid. The noise reached the top of the stairs, and there it stopped right above us. For a moment, the house tasted like copper. Then, from the bedroom, we heard the sound of the mattress dipping, like someone sitting down. It was light and quick. I had a sudden absurd image of an old woman at the foot of the bed, knitting. My stomach clenched. We crept upstairs with the flashlight and pushed open the bedroom door. The bed was empty. There was, however, an indentation on the side of the mattress as if someone had just stood and left. On the bedside table, next to the lamp, lay the owner's old book we had been looking through when we first moved in. The page in the book had been opened to a folded scrap of paper. On the paper was a line of writing, 4 words, penciled in a shaky hand. "Do not watch the water." We stared at it for longer than is rational. The house hummed. Outside, the lake was a dark smear. We could not sleep that night. At dawn, we walked down to the dock. The water was oddly still. The missing board had been replaced with a plank, new and clean, set into the old wood like a bad tooth. There were no footprints on the path we had walked a week before. The loop of twine was gone. That afternoon, I found a small jar in the basement between the paint cans. It was filled with smooth, dark stones and something that looked like dried algae. Tucked beneath the stones was another scrap of paper. This time, the handwriting was different, a fast, cramped script. When it listens, it learns. Keep low. Don't leave doors open. We left the next day for the city, partly because we were scared and partly because the idea of staying felt like bait. We packed quickly, leaving behind the book and the scraps. The owner called the moment we turned onto the highway. He thanked us for taking care of the place. When I told him we were leaving, he said, softly, "Good, it asked for you." I thought it was over. We told ourselves we wouldn't go back. You can rationalize a lot of things in daylight. We moved back to our normal life, we told friends, we laughed about it. But a month later, my partner woke me at 3 in the morning. She was pale and shaking. On her phone was a photo she had taken in the living room, a picture we had taken during one of the first nights to show friends how cozy the place was. The photo had been sent from an unknown number at 2:46 a.m. It was the same living room. In the dark corner by the stairs, where no one should have been standing, there was a figure. Not clear, not human in definition, more like a shadow that had been folded around the chair. It had a face, if you could call it that, a suggestion of hollows where a face would be, and 2 points like wet coins for eyes. It looked toward the camera, and in the glass of the window behind it, a second, fainter reflection showed a hand pressed to the glass, fingers splayed and elongated. The message with the photo read only, "It watches better when you leave the light. We blocked the number." I called the number back and it connected to an old voicemail box that had been closed for years. We considered going to the police. We thought about contacting the owner. We did neither. 2 months later, when the sun had the brittle quality of late autumn, my partner got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single scrap of the same old paper, folded carefully. On it were the 4 words written in the same shaky hand as before, "Do not watch the water." Below it, someone had added, smaller and uneven, "It likes faces." I didn't mean to keep the house as long as I did. It was supposed to be temporary, a month, maybe 2. I took the job managing the lake house for an older couple who split their time between Florida and Seattle. They had a box of keys and a list of preferred plumbers. I had a duffel bag and a playlist that helped the nights feel less empty. The house sat a few hundred yards from the dirt road, close enough to the water that you could hear it if the wind was right. You learned the shape of that sound quickly, a soft, indifferent lapping, like a hand rubbing its thumb against a glass rim. The first week was easy. Daylight was filled with maintenance that was boring and specific, clearing gutters, checking the generator, making sure the solar lights still worked. The evenings were quieter. I would make a sandwich, sit at the kitchen island, and listen as the house settled. Old houses have a language. Doors that click as they finish cooling. Pipes that hiss in the early morning. This one sighed a lot, like it couldn't decide whether to sleep or keep watch. On the 3rd night, I woke to the sound of something heavy on the porch. Not stomping, that would have been honest, but a careful, hesitant weight shifting, as if someone were testing the boards to see whether they held. The porch light was on when I stood and looked through the blinds. There was nothing there but the black of the yard and a pair of deck chairs with towels draped over them. I told myself it was an animal, raccoons making a path. I closed the blinds and went back to bed. It started with small things after that. A towel moved from the chair to the railing. A glass I had left on the coffee table ended up on the floor, untouched but knocked aside as if a breeze had brushed it. The progressive way of those moments is what unnerved me. They were undramatic enough to be alarming, only enough to insist I notice them again and again. I began leaving the porch light on every night. It made me feel less alone. Maybe that's a lie. Maybe it made me feel more watched, because the light made shapes on the dark water. Shapes that didn't belong to trees. The lake is shallow near the shore and thick with reeds. At dawn, you can sometimes see the outline of something long and dark below the surface. People who grew up around lakes call it the eel line, a shadow that rolls with the current. I told myself that was what I saw. It's what everyone would say, it's what I said at first. Weeks passed. The owners asked for a phone check-in every Tuesday. I would sit at the kitchen island with my phone and tell some gentle lie about the state of the place. All good, I'd say. No issues. And then I'd hang up and listen to the house breathe for another hour. Once, the call came late. "Are you still there?" Mrs. Hargraves asked. I told her yes, and that I was making tea. I didn't tell her I had woken 3 times in the night to footsteps on the porch. One Saturday, I got a delivery, a box of driftwood coasters from an online shop. The driver set them on the front steps and left. I took them in, opened them up, and stacked them on the table. The next morning, there were wet footprints across the kitchen floor, leading from the back door to the dining room. They were the size and shape of bare feet. They weren't mine. I sleep with socks. They didn't look like any shoe. And the path stopped at the window that faced the lake, the glass slightly fogged from the inside. I stood there for a long time and watched my reflection, a pale ghost with dark circles under my eyes, and told myself I must have tracked water in without noticing. On a Wednesday in late October, the fog came heavy off the lake. It pressed against the windows like breath. I sat with my hands cupped around a mug and watched it move, watching for the outline of the vessel someone once told me was under the water, an old rowboat that had sunk decades ago. There was a plan. If I saw anything that looked like trouble, I would call the owners. If it persisted, I'd leave. But when the fog thickened, sound changed. The lake's lapping became muffled. The trees stopped their constant whisper. That's when I first heard the knocking. It was soft, 3 strikes, paused, 2 quick ones, then silence. It came from the side of the house that faced the water. You'd think it would be obvious if someone were on the other side. But I walked around the entire perimeter and found nothing, just the sodden reeds and a line of lawn marked by the path of nocturnal animals. Everything was damp, everything smelled like river and rot. My hands smelled like the lake for the rest of the day. After that night, sleep abandoned me. I would close my eyes and see the fog pressing, and in the fog something would hesitate, like a person deciding whether to step from shadow to porch. I began to check the windows constantly. I learned where the blind cord snagged. I learned the exact position to leave the stove knob so it clicked twice when you turned it. People say the mind makes monsters when it's tired. Maybe that's true. But a mind-making monster still needs a body to carry it, and my body began to follow the indications of whatever was there. I stopped leaving food on the counter. I started locking the back door twice. I left my phone on the island, face up, where I could see the screen light if it rang. One night, the screen lit up at 3:14 a.m. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, listening to the static hum, and then faint, like someone at the end of a long tunnel, a scraping cough. Nothing else. No voice. The next day, the battery on the landline was dead. I don't mean the battery icon. The whole phone was rendered useless, like it had been submerged and dried out in a single breath. There was no dial tone. There was, however, a single new scuff on the back door, a shallow horizontal mark at hip level. It matched nothing I could come up with. It wasn't high enough to be from an animal's S-claws and not low enough for a child. It sat there, a line that suggested someone had leaned in and then pulled away. I considered leaving. I really did. I packed a bag once. I stood in the kitchen with my keys in my hand and the morning stretching pale behind the fogged windows, and I listened. The house was quiet in that precarious way houses are before someone decides what to do next. And then, a sound so ordinary I almost laughed. The kettle clicked off in the pantry. It wasn't where the kettle belonged. I walked into the pantry slowly. The kettle lay on the floor, water cooling, its cord coiled under it like a tail. Nothing else was out of place. But in the corner, against the back wall, there was a small footprint in the dust, pressed with 1 minute of intention. It was the size of a child's, perhaps the kind of foot that fit in the little canvas shoes they sell at tourist shops near lakes. The toes pointed toward the door. After that, things escalated not with violence but with presence. Doors that had been latched would be found open by a finger width. Chairs would be angled away from the table, as if someone had been sitting, decided to stand, and then left without trace. Once, I found a trail of tiny pebbles leading from the water line across the lawn to the back steps. Each one placed the same distance apart, like someone counting their steps. Neighbors noticed. Old Mr. Alvarez came by one afternoon with a thermos and a look that said he lived a long time and had matched strange nights to stranger consequences. He sat on the porch and didn't ask too many questions. Houses by water hide things, he said slowly, but they also let things go. You don't let them stay. He didn't tell me how to make them go. He just left a small jar of salt on the sill and said, "Put it where the light can't touch." I did as he said because it felt like doing anything. I put the jar in the pantry on a shelf just under the hanging row of mason jars. That night the knocking stopped. For 3 nights there was only the ordinary house noise, the pipes, the settling, the low, patient chorus of frogs from the reeds. I slept like someone who had been given a temporary reprieve, and in my dreams I could swim through the dark glass of the lake and find the glowing outline of something that watched me without moving. The peace didn't last. The knocking came back, but this time it was softer and came from inside the house. I was in bed and awake, paradoxically alert and numb, when I heard it at the far end of the hall. Someone gently knocking on the wall. The plaster one would knock gently to ask permission. I didn't move. I told myself calmly what to do in a horror movie. Don't engage, don't answer. But the knocks came again, a little more insistent. Then, in the kitchen, the kettle clicked on by itself. It wasn't the old metal kettle. It was the electric one, kind of the safety switch. The light over the island flicked twice and settled. The kettle clicked, bubbled, and then was quiet. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The salt jar from Mr. Alvarez's porch was shattered on the counter. Its white granular mass spilled across the laminate like an unmade bed. There was no footprint nearby. There was, however, a pattern in the salt. 3 arcs pressed as if by fingertips. They were too deliberate to be accidental. I left that night. I drove until the headlights cut the fog into a waking stripe and the house and lake were behind me, a smear of black on my rear view. I stayed at a motel and told myself I'd come back in the morning and clean up and go. I told myself I would do this the next day and the day after until the owners returned. In the morning, I went back. The drive felt like walking into a photograph that had been left in the sun, colors already fading. The porch light was on. The salt jar sat whole on the pantry shelf where I had put it. The familiarly wrong things were back to being ordinary. The kettle sat on the counter as if it had never stirred. There was a single damp towel folded on the chair. I told myself I had dreamed the last night. I told myself the motel had been a refuge and that I had dreamt of returning to a house that never believed me. There was one final thing. A neighbor kid came by with his bike that afternoon, asking if I'd seen his dog. He panted about the dog named Milo and said, in a way that children do when they tell a detail is important, he goes to the water sometimes. He listens. He shrugged like it was nothing. He listens, then he doesn't come back right away. I felt my throat tighten and asked, How long ago? The kid hesitated. A week. Sometimes he comes back with reeds in his fur. Sometimes he comes back late. I asked him if Milo had come back that morning. He shook his head, and his eyes were oddly old for a child. No, he was at the shore, and he kept looking, he said. Then he sat down like he was tired of looking. He didn't stand up when I called. Later that night, after the kid left, but before I could sleep, I opened the back door and stood on the threshold. The fog lay low and thick against the lawn. The lake was a black coin. For a long time I didn't hear anything but the small live noises of the reeds and my own breath. Then, faint and patient, someone from the other side tapped 3 times on the glass of the sliding door, my mirror, catching my reflection. I stood very still and waited to see if the sound came again. It did, 3 slow knocks, then 2 quick ones, just like the night early on when I first heard it. I realized, with a cold sort of clarity, that whatever it was, it had learned the house. It knew where the panes were thin. It learned to knock in the pattern of someone who was used to being invited in. I turned the deadbolt and walked back into the kitchen. The lights were all off. The house didn't sound like a house anymore. It sounded like a rib cage, breath collecting. I wished for a noise, a radio, a dog barking, anything to puncture the silence. The only sound I could find was the kettle, somewhere in the distance, clicking once. I put my hand on the counter and felt the little groove where someone had been tracing letters in the wood. When I leaned close, I could see the faint indent of a single line, like a name partially erased. I could not read it. I realized then that the house had been keeping things for a long time. Missing things, names half remembered, footprints that led nowhere. I slept poorly, and when I woke, the fog had lifted and the lake was ordinary. I told myself I would finish my few remaining tasks, lock up, and finally be done. I made a list. I checked boxes. At the edge of noon, I opened the back door to take out the trash. Something on the porch moved, shifting away under the chairs. I frowned, bent to pick up a bottle, and froze. Against the lip of one of the chair legs, pressed into the wood by points that could only have been teeth, was a small strip of fabric. A scrap of canvas, like from a child's shoe. It was soaked and smelled faintly of rot. I folded it into the palm of my hand and felt the echo of wet. There were no other footprints nearby. The reed line at the edge of the water had been smoothed as if someone had rested there and then left without disturbing the mud. For a second I thought the lake would speak. It did not. They never told me what was under the water. The owners never asked. I left with my duffel and my playlist and the house behind me feeling like a thing I deborrowed and returned with a stain I couldn't quite name. I drove away thinking I had escaped. The knock pattern, 3 slow, 2 quick, lingered in my head like a tune I hadn't learned. Months later, late one winter night, I had the radio on low and a storm rolling over the city. I woke to the sound of something tapping on my apartment window. It was the pattern I knew. I turned on the light. The street was empty, and the rain made the panes smear. There was nothing on the sill, just the faint, wet print of a fingertip that didn't belong to anything I could see. It was as small and deliberate as the letters in the kitchen counter, and as heavy as the quiet the house had learned to keep. I don't know what followed the lake house. I don't know if things learn to move when they're left too long. I only know that the night that tap came 3 slow, 2 quick, I closed the curtains and stopped sleeping with the light off. Sometimes when the fog comes low over my city and the rain sounds like someone dragging their nails along a slate roof, I can almost hear the lapping of that lake under everything else. There are nights I still dream of standing at the back door, watching the fog press itself to the glass. In the dream, something taps the pane in that slow, patient rhythm and waits. When I wake, I check the windows, but sometimes, not always, I find a single damp scrap on the sill. I didn't plan to stay the night at the lake house. It was supposed to be a weekend 2 days to clear my head after a messy breakup and a week of late shifts. My friend Mark had offered his parents' place, said it was quiet, cheap to heat, and only an hour's drive away. It sat on the far side of a small lake that most people in town only drove past on their way to the state park. I liked the idea of being alone, of waking up to nothing but the stretch of water and the far tree line. The house looked smaller than in the photo's older siding, a crooked porch light, but when I stepped inside, it was familiar in the way old houses are. The faint smell of pine cleaner, an unsteady clock on the mantel, and a stack of outdated magazines. Mark's mom had left a note on the fridge, emergency numbers inside. Don't forget to close windows. That detail felt oddly specific, but I shrugged it off. I started a fire in the wood stove, made a pot of coffee, and sat by the living room window watching the lake as the late afternoon slid into dusk. At first, the sounds were ordinary, the soft slap of the water against the rocks, a far-off dog barking, a car on the distant road. Then, as the light dimmed, the lake seemed to exhale. The slapping faded into a kind of wet hush. Branches whispered together in a wind that didn't reach the house. It's hard to describe because nothing loud happened. It was more like the world around the lake was closing its mouth and listening. I was half asleep on the couch when I heard the step on the porch. Not a big, announcing step, just the quiet give of a foot on wood. I froze, because there shouldn't have been anyone. Mark had said his parents were in Florida, and the place wasn't exactly on anyone's route. I told myself it could be a raccoon or a deer rubbing its antlers. The house's porch made odd noises at night. I told myself that until I heard the knock. It was 3 light, polite raps, like someone checking whether anyone was home. I didn't answer. Whoever it was knocked again, slower this time, then stopped. The silence after those 3 knocks was worse than the knocks themselves. It stretched and layered on top of the other quiet, making the room feel smaller. I waited, listening. Something moved away from the porch. No, not away. It went around the house. I heard the hopping of feet, careful and close to the wall, then a soft thud near the back. The kitchen sink rattled lightly, and the back window caught a shadow crossing it. I should have called someone. I didn't. I told myself the sensible things, maybe a neighbor checking on the property, a kid with a flashlight. I brewed another coffee and kept watching the window until my eyes blurred. When I finally got up, I moved like someone who had agreed to play along with a game. I checked the doors, all latched. I drew the curtains at the back, careful not to peek. The porch light blinked off, and on across the yard, someone moving. I told myself I'd lock the deadbolt, stay inside, and wait for morning. Sleep didn't come. I nodded off in fits and starts, waking every time a small sound happened. A twig snapping, the fridge humming, the heat making the pipes click. At some point I heard footsteps again, clearer this time, but inside. They were in the hallway that led to the bedrooms, the slow, methodical put-together of steps that people make when they're trying not to wake anyone. My heart did that small jump people are trained to notice in movies, the one where you think you'll leap, but don't. I kept my breathing even and told myself to call Mark, to call the police. I held the phone and listened to it tick in my hand like a small animal. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. There was a pause, long and waiting, like someone had forgotten what they were doing. Then a scraping sound like a fingernail along the wood. It was soft enough to be mistaken for a branch. It was deliberate enough not to be. The next morning I found the bathroom door pen. I remember thinking it couldn't be more than coincidence, maybe I left it that way. But the soap lay flat on the rim of the tub, and the towel on the rack was folded in the way I never folded towels. Someone had stood in my bathroom, and the idea of that made the inside of my throat tighten. I told myself to leave, to drive home, but the first truly bright light of day changed something. The lake in daylight is honest in a way night isn't. It shows the scum line, the pale underwater logs, the way the reeds hide small islands of mud. I took the kayak tied to the back of the house and pushed out because being on the water felt safer than being in the house where someone might still be. On the lake, the house looked smaller from a distance, and the trees seemed to lean away from it. It was as if the land was trying to forget what had happened there the night before. Halfway across, my paddle tapped something in the water. A plank, a bit of dock maybe, floating close enough to tug at the boat. I leaned down and saw a shoe. A worn, waterlogged shoe tied laces knotted with a steady hand.
There was no body.
The shoe looked like it had been there long enough to be accepted. Mud clung to the sole, a small, sharp smell of rot. I brought it back to the porch, feeling the small, animal dread that settles when you realize the world has begun to disagree with you. That afternoon, I found other things. Small piles of stones arranged at the end of the dock. A ring of sticks around the fire pit. The back of the house bore faint scuff marks, too high for a child, too neat for a stray animal. The scuffs looked deliberate, like someone had dragged a hand along the siding. On the windowsill of the guest room, somebody had left a single matchbook, unopened, face down. No note. No footprints in the grass leading to or from the matchbook. The night the knocks came again. Once, twice, 3 times. I didn't react at first. Then, when the pattern changed, it became a slow, steady tapping like someone counting. The kitchen clock chimed midnight. The tapping paused at the chime. When it started again, someone was humming. I could tell, because the rhythm of the tapping shifted with the song inside it. I never heard the lyrics. The tune was low and broken, like something half-remembered from a radio. I opened the door on impulse. I stood on the porch and called out, voice more steady than I felt. No reply. The only answer was the lake, dark and still. A wet breeze lifted the hair at my neck. I walked the edge of the yard to the dock because I couldn't do nothing. It felt like the only thing to do. At the end of the dock, facing the water, a figure stood. Not close, maybe 15 yards away, but its head turned exactly when I stopped. No one moved other than that small shift of the head. It was a silhouette, thin against the black, and it had the air of something waiting for permission. I called out again. The figure didn't move. Then it lifted one hand, slow and careful, and placed it to its mouth like someone signaling quiet. The shape of that hand in the dim could have been anyone's. It could have been a person joking around, a prank. It could have been a raccoon standing against the night. But there was something precise and patient about it. I backed away and broke into a run, as if running away from the lake would make me less naive. I didn't sleep after that. I packed the car at dawn with trembling fingers and didn't look back until I was on the highway. I told myself I was done with the place. I told myself everything would be fine once I was out of town. I got home and changed my number. I told Mark the story and he laughed at first, then stopped when I described the matchbook and the shoe. He had never mentioned those things. He said his parents would be back in 2 weeks, asked why I hadn't called him, said I should have called the police. I said I would. I didn't. Days later, I found a message stuck into the doorway of my apartment. No stamp, no return address. A matchbook, face down, exactly like the one on the guest room windowsill. There was no note. I held it in my hand and felt the weight of the small brown cardboard. Someone had been at least close enough to touch my door, enough to fit that trivial thing through the gap. I drove back to the lake the next night, because that's what you do when something refuses to be explained. You confront it. The house was dark. The dock sagged. The water pulled and lapped as if it were trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. I stood on the lawn and watched a figure leave the end of the dock and walk toward the trees, not a person so much as the dark itself moving with intention. It didn't look back. I tried to sleep on the porch. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name soft, careful, like a neighbor checking to see if someone had overslept. I sat up so quick I cut my elbow on the bench. The whisper stopped. There was a smear of wet on the wood where someone had rested their palm. I put my hand where it had been and felt the cold ring of the water. There's a habit people have when something harasses them, small, stupid rituals that make the world feel more ordered. You lock doors, you leave lights on, you tell yourself you're rational. That night I left every light on in the house and slept with the television murmuring a late-night talk show. The talk show's laugh track became a thin shield. When I woke, there was a single footprint on the living room rug. Bare, wet, a bit smaller than mine. It had toes splayed like someone who'd been standing in the water and then came inside. The footprint didn't lead anywhere. It began at the rug and stopped at the couch, as if whoever had made it had stopped to sit and then vanished. I moved out the next day. I gave the keys back to Mark with hands that shook. He thanked me, said he'd checked the locks for his parents, said it was probably a couple of kids playing pranks. I wanted to believe him. I tried to, for a while. I get messages sometimes small and almost polite. A photo taken from the far side of the street where I used to live, the camera catches. The corner of my house at night, and in the reflection of the window there, the faint shape of someone standing with their hand to their mouth. Once there was a voicemail heavy breathing, then a slow, soft hum that matched the tapping I remember from that night on the porch. No words, just a tune that dips like a question. I don't go back. I tell myself I never will. But sometimes when the wind is right and the night is quiet, I can feel the memory of that hand against the doorframe, the ghost of a matchbook on my palm, and the way the lake seems to hold its breath waiting for someone to knock. If you drive past that lake, keep your windows up and the radio on. If you stay in a house by the water, check the porch light and lock the back door. And if you hear someone tapping 3 light raps, polite and patient, don't answer. Because whatever waits at the water's edge is patient in a way we aren't, and it prefers you know you were visited, even if you never see who came.